History is neither dead nor past. With Europe back in the headlines, George Friedman's Flashpoints, the emerging crisis in Europe, underscores the dormant forces in the European continent. Thought-provoking as ever, the study draws heavily from history to reveal a fascinating geopolitical examination and the revival of old quarrels. I'm your host Shivan and welcome to a CaspianReport review for the bookshelf. About 2 decades ago, George Friedman founded the private intelligence firm Stratfor, where he and his staff published geopolitical studies. Most of their products focus on trends in global politics, technology, population, culture, and are delivered in the realist school narrative. Friedman resigned in 2015 and then founded another consultancy bureau where he continues to publish geopolitical forecasts. He is also the author of several books, the latest of which is Flashpoints. In a little more than 250 pages divided in 3 parts and 16 chapters, he details the strengths and vulnerabilities of Europe. He also weaves in his individual experiences by bringing up his family history. As a descendant of a Hungarian Jewish family who escaped the Nazis and the communists only by chance, the author describes being Jewish as the family's primary identity, while being in Hungary was a matter of geography. This story is fascinating on its own, but it also adds a personal lens to the narrative that makes the context feel more sympathetic. Friedman then begins the history of post-medieval Europe, starting from the 15th century. Columbus revealed that Europe was not the center of the world. Martin Luther showed that Rome was not the center of Europe, and Copernicus argued that the Earth was not the center of the universe. These revelations led to revolutions in science, military, economy, and politics. Later, in 1561, Francis Bacon formulated the scientific revolution, where knowledge was based on evidence through observation and experimentation. As authority shifted from religious texts to individual judgments, humanitarian philosophies took root. All this led to the Enlightenment movement of the 17th and 18th centuries, where rationale and reason overcame superstition. However, as individual interpretation became a force in its own right, Europe fragmented into smaller nations. By the 20th century, nationalism, in addition to science, governed modern Europe. This summary of events is quite condensed and obviously leaves out many significant developments. But then again, history is not the main premise of Flashpoints. Instead, history is used to give context to the current situation. The opening chapters of the book explain how Europe achieved political, military, economic, and intellectual supremacy to become the standard bearer of civilization, only to lose everything in the decades between 1914 and 1945. It is in the second half of the book where the discussion enters a different tone and examines the historical focal points of repeated conflicts. Not surprisingly, many of these hotspots are found in the borderlands of nations, such as the Mediterranean, the Balkans, the Baltics, the Caucasus, etc. The author essentially argues that the post-1945 era, also known as the Long Peace, is coming to a conclusion and that the continent is slipping back to the days of old. As a book based on the realist school of international relations, the arguments made in Flashpoints are based on hard, unchangeable realities. The book illustrates that political leaders are ultimately subject to their geographies and their access to resources, which explains why the same conflicts continue to erupt over and over again in the same areas. If you enjoy geopolitics as much as I do, you'll fit right in these chapters. Friedman is skeptical when it comes to the European Union. He acknowledges that the bloc has brought peace and prosperity to the continent by pacifying France and Germany, but he is not convinced that after centuries of horrifying hostilities, the points of friction have been erased completely. This claim is not unfounded. The first cracks began appearing with the economic crash of 2008. Wealthy nations, such as Germany, managed to weather the financial storm, but less fortunate states like Greece sank further into bankruptcy. Tensions emerged between export-driven Germany and the South European nations, which were tied to each other by the euro. Meanwhile, also in 2008, Russia had recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union and began pushing west. In Georgia, two regions broke away with the help of Russian troops. By 2014, the Kremlin felt confident enough to invade and annex the Ukrainian province of Crimea. In doing so, Putin discovered that NATO's military capacity and commitment is quite feeble and subject to political will. As a result, the Russians are seeking to dominate Ukraine entirely by federalizing the country. Amidst these developments, the Germans have the most durable geography to stand up to the Russian advances. In Friedman's view, Berlin is not seeking for a fight. The Germans are simultaneously afraid of what they have achieved and tremendously proud of it. However, in East Europe, there is a sea of small nation-states that are unable to answer Moscow's push westward, leaving the Germans as the only contender to the Russians. Thus, the conflict in Ukraine is part of a more extensive geopolitical campaign between Berlin and Moscow. Going into the future, the borderlands of Eastern Europe, specifically the areas that were once under Soviet control, will see the return of a more assertive Russia. These hotspots are likely to evolve as they have in Crimea, Ukraine, and Georgia. That is quite a bold prediction, but what is most impressive in Flashpoints is that while the author analyzes each area, he never explains the relationship between nations in terms of ideology or attributes developments to individual political leaders. This is a big break from other political books. For instance, while many books frame the Ukrainian conflict as an assault on European values, Friedman portrays the battle as Russia's rational interest to push west to minimize the threat from NATO. That being said, Friedman offers no resolutions. He merely observes and identifies hotspots and suggests that despite our intellectual pursuits, Europe's fragmented geography, historical animosities, and changing demographics is likely to restart history. Overall, Flashpoints is an enjoyable and inspiring book that deepens one's understanding of Europe, where it has come from, how it fits in the world, and where it is going. It is the study of modern-day Europe that includes its remarkable past as well as its simmering fault lines that are bound to play an essential role in the near future. If you wish to understand the current trends in Europe, what is impossible, what is necessary, what is trivial, and what determines the behavior of nations, Flashpoints offers a pragmatic guide. This was a Caspian Report review for the bookshelf. Check out our playlist for other reviews and book recommendations. Also, credit goes to our Patreon community for supporting our content. For more information, visit the link in the description. In any case, thank you for your time and Sarol.